Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kalb, the Senior Advisor to the Pulitzer Center and the Murrow Professor Emeritus at Harvard, and it is my pleasure to have been asked to moderate this discussion, which has to do with Iran, nuclear weapons, the negotiation currently underway in Vienna, and just a brief summary of where we are. This negotiation started about a year ago. The last 6 months following on an initial agreement is going to go until this coming Sunday. And presumably if they get an agreement by then, a lot of people are going to be very happy and some people will be miserable. But if they don't get an agreement, the likelihood is that there will be an extension for a month, possibly a little longer than that, but not a long time. And this negotiation centers on an old question that's been with us really for a long time, and that is, will Iran develop a nuclear weapon? And the United States has been on record, one president after another, as saying that the United States will stop that from happening, that it will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And the options before the US and before policymakers essentially have boiled down to one, for the US to continue to pursue an agreement that would accept some uranium enrichment on the part of Iran, but going along with very strict curtailment on any kind of other activities. And another option, which would be no uranium enrichment by Iran at all. So what do the American people think about this? And here is where a new survey, which we are going to be talking about today, that has been conducted by the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland, and specifically the Program for Public Consultation here, and done under the directorship of Stephen Cull, comes in, is not only handy, but is extremely illuminating in understanding where the American people fit into this. It is clear from any number of other surveys regarding other issues that the American people right now are not interested in getting involved in another war in the Middle East. And so if the option, as far as the American people are concerned, is stopping the Iranians from building a nuclear weapon, or if you fail going to war in the Middle East, the likelihood is that by some reluctant acceptance, the US, the American people would be more interested in finding some kind of compromise with the Iranians than going to the extreme and forbidding them to have any kind of nuclear weapons. And this new survey, which Stephen will talk to us about in just a minute, astonishingly, at the very top, astonishingly, at least for me, is that 61% of the American people, and when you deal with numbers and polls, that's a lot of people, 61% of the American people favor making a deal with Iran that would limit Iran's enrichment capacity, at the same time imposing additional intrusive inspections in exchange for the lifting of some of the sanctions against Iran. So the American people are prepared, according to this poll, conducted in a very special way. And I would like to ask Stephen Cull now to come up here and explain to us the way in which this poll was conducted, because it's no ordinary poll. Sir.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. You can put that there. So this question about Iran is a major question in America today. We're headed to this deadline of July 20th, at which point we should have a resolution or not, or perhaps an extension. Now, judging from the statements on the floor of Congress these days, it seems that there is not really a consensus. The administration has been pursuing a course of action in the negotiations, but many in Congress on both sides of the aisle have called for a very different approach. that does not allow for any level of enrichment, that calls for increasing sanctions, and so on. So this seems to us to be a key time to consult the American people about what U.S. foreign policy should be in regard to Iran. Now, if you look at existing polls, it does not give you a conclusive answer to this question. People do not have much information. We found that out in this current survey, and there was another survey that asked, what do you think, or don't you have enough information? And more than 40% said, I just don't have enough information. Some of the polls have also been flawed. They talk about Iran's nuclear weapons program, which obviously injects bias right from the beginning. And responses have ranged from a divided response to 64% approving of some kind of deal, but there are also divided responses on the question of sanctions. And the information that's in the questions is just very limited. So what we have been doing at the Program for Public Consultation is developing another kind of method that goes beyond the initial response that one goes for in a classical standard poll, particularly a political poll where you're just trying to get a sense of what people's initial reaction is, but to try to get at what are the public's underlying values and priorities in relation to these issues. So this requires actually giving people some information. Oh, would immediately go, oh, well, there's got to be bias in that, any kind of information. Well, we've developed a method where we consult people on both sides of the aisle in developing this process. We call it a policymaking simulation. And they're given a briefing. I'll show you, here are the elements of it. They're given a briefing initially. They're presented policy options. Initially, they evaluate the policy options. We kind of call it a soft evaluation, where you say, well, what if we did do this? How would you feel? And they evaluate each one separately on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 represents not at all acceptable, 10 very acceptable, and 5 just tolerable. Then we go through a series of pro and con arguments for each option. And again, these are developed together with congressional staffers and outside experts, again, from both sides of the aisle, and people representing different points of view on the issue. Afterwards, they reevaluate them separately. And then finally, and only then, do they make their recommendation about what U.S. foreign policy should be. So, who do we do this with? We did this with a representative sample of 748 Americans. It was done with GFK's knowledge panel, which is it's a probability-based panel. People are recruited by mail and phone and so on. If they don't have internet access, they're given it, so then they can answer the questionnaire over the internet, which is much better for this kind of process where people can really look at the question and reread it as many times as they want and really make sure that they know what's going on, rather than being rushed through the questionnaire as it is often on the phone. So it was done June 28th through July 7th. The margin of error is 3.6 to 3.9, depending upon your different methods for assessing that. Okay, so we start with a briefing, and we say the main focus of this policymaking simulation will be what the United States should do about Iran's nuclear program. As you may know, the U.S. is currently in negotiations with Iran and will soon reach a point where it needs to make a key decision. We would like to know your recommendation about what the U.S. should do, but first we need to give you some background. So then we tell them about the Non-Proliferation Treaty that the U.S., Iran, and other countries had signed back in 1970, and we asked, how much have you heard about this treaty? Well, 6% say nothing at all, and 28% say just a little, 22% some, 4% a lot. So you see right from the beginning there's a significant information gap. We also ask in regard to Iran, in establishing the NPT, all members that did not already have nuclear weapons agreed to not develop them. And Iran is one of those members that has agreed to not to develop nuclear weapons. Did you know that? And 2/3 said that they had not heard this, only 1/3 knew this, and there wasn't a lot of difference among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So then we took them through this briefing where we clarified under the NPT, Iran can have a nuclear energy program, but they're not a nuclear weapons program. And Iran is required as an NPT member to provide information to the IAEA and accept inspections to assure that its program is only for peaceful purposes. And we explained that there are these two levels of enrichment, the 5% level for nuclear energy and the 90% for nuclear weapons. And we talk about the issues related to Iran's nuclear program. It's more thorough than when I'm just kind of hitting the highlights, and you, of course, can read the entire simulation. So in 2002, the IAEA determined that Iran had been building an enrichment facility without informing the agency and had other activities that could be related to developing a nuclear weapon. Now, from 2003 to 2006, Iran suspended work towards enrichment and cooperated with the IAEA as part of an international efforts to resolve the issue, but no final agreement resulted, and Iran resumed enrichment. Then the UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding that Iran suspend its enrichment activities and imposing some economic sanctions. Now, in regard to the question of sanctions, we thought there were a few key things that people needed to know. One is the U.S. has already stopped all its trade with Iran well before in the past. And the new sanctions that the U.S. has imposed more recently related to Iran's nuclear programs are aimed at other countries' business with Iran and have reduced such business. So we imply sanctions on other countries who do business with Iran, or we don't if they stop, of course. And then in regard to the current negotiations, the U.S., Germany, and other key members of the UN Security Council are in a round of negotiations with Iran. There's a temporary 6-month agreement that was reached in November in which Iran permitted more intensive IAEA inspections in return for some moderation of sanctions. The negotiations focus on creating a system for limiting Iran's enrichment to the low levels necessary for nuclear energy, which would be ensured through intrusive inspections. Should underscore again, this is not something that is fully accepted in Congress as a premise. The negotiations have made progress, and Iran has cooperated in its short-term obligations, but a long-term agreement has not been reached, and there's now a lot of excitement as what's going to happen between now and July 20th. So, based on speeches on the floor of Congress, our interaction with the staffers and so on, the core issue that we identified that is really the hub of the thing boils down to this, that there are two major options. One is that for the U.S. to continue to pursue a long-term agreement that limits Iran's enrichment of uranium. Iran would accept intrusive inspections of their program, while the U.S. would accept Iran enriching to the low level necessary for nuclear energy and the U.S. would gradually ease some sanctions provided that Iran sticks to the agreement. The other option is to not negotiate an agreement that includes Iran having limited enrichment, but rather impose new sanctions on other countries to get them to cut their economic relations with Iran, to pressure Iran to agree to completely stop all uranium enrichment. So we started by, okay, let's just get your initial response now that they've gotten the briefing. And on that scale, we're with 0 to 10 scale with the numbers that say 0 to 4, not acceptable, the approach of negotiating limits. 21% said it was not acceptable, 32% chose 5, meaning just tolerable, 46% gave it a score above 5 of acceptable. Separately, they also were asked about the notion of increasing sanctions with the goal of stopping all enrichment. That didn't do as well. 34% found it acceptable, 30% tolerable, 35% not acceptable, but you still have 2/3 saying that they could tolerate it. It's not a real decisive one way or the other. They kind of could go either way, though they lean a little more to the negotiating limit side. There wasn't a lot of difference between Republicans and Democrats. On independents, as you'll continually see, are out of step with the others, but the Republicans and Democrats are remarkably similar in up and down the line throughout this study. And so you can see that 47% of Republicans and Democrats found the idea of negotiating limits acceptable. In terms of increasing sanctions, almost as many, 41% of Republicans felt that way, fewer number of Democrats, 30%. So now we had them evaluate the arguments, and I'm just going to read you a few of them to give you a feel for it. First, they were presented, it's structured kind of like a debate. First, there's a proposition, and they're presented arguments in favor of negotiating limits, and they're presented 3 arguments. And here's an example of one. No matter what happens, making a deal with Iran to limit its enrichment will put us ahead of where we are now. If Iran sticks with the deal, we'll know that they're making a nuclear weapon. If they try to break out of the deal with more intrusive inspections, we will have much better means to spot it immediately, and it will be so completely clear that we'll be better able to mobilize the world against them. Either way, we come out ahead. And that got pretty strong response. 63% said they found it convincing. We don't ask, do you agree or disagree, just how convincing do you find it as an argument? And 63% said that they found it convincing. And that was pretty much the same, depending upon partisan affiliation. Another argument, getting Iran to limit its enrichment is the only reasonable goal. As a member of the NPT, Iran agreed to not have nuclear weapons, but it never agreed to not enrich uranium. The treaty even recognizes all nations' right to a nuclear energy program. We would never let other countries tell us whether or not we can make our own nuclear fuel. And 62% found that one convincing. And Democrats and Republicans were pretty much the same. Independents divided again. Again, you find this, you'll see this throughout. The independents have this kind of divided, less decisive response. It's not unusual. There was another one, I won't read through it in great detail, but it starts out, the only real option is to make a deal with the Iranian government, and makes that case. And people didn't particularly like that, it's our only real option, so the numbers were a little bit lower on this one. But as you see, all 3 got majorities overall, and with both Republicans and Democrats. But now, looking on the con side, the arguments against this notion of negotiating limits, the UN Security Council told Iran to stop enrichment, but Iran has been defiant. We should not reward Iran's defiance by giving in and letting it go ahead and enrich. This will lead others to defy international rules to extract concessions. We need to set an example and make it clear that countries that defy the international system will eventually regret it. The international community needs to stick to its guns. And this got 2/3, 67%, a little higher than on the other side. By the way, this is not unusual. This is common for people to find arguments on both sides convincing. Don't you have that experience? Well, yeah, that's a point. Yeah, that's a point. Remember, we're not asking them to choose at this point. And again, pretty similar between the parties, but the Republicans a little bit stronger. One more example. Giving up the international sanctions that have been so difficult to put in place is very risky. If the international sanctions are dismantled, at some point Iraq could decide it is safe to break out of the treaty and race for nuclear weapons. Then it could take so long to reassemble the international systems of sanctions that Iran could make so much progress that we could end up facing a nuclear-armed Iran. And again, that does pretty well. 64% find it convincing on both sides. And there's one other argument that you can read too that doesn't do quite as well, but still gets majorities. Now looking on the side in favor of increasing sanctions, we have the international sanctions in place now, along with the UN Security Council resolutions calling for Iran to stop the enrichment. It's no time to ease off and accept limited enrichment. We need to keep this momentum going and get other countries to cut their business ties to Iran until it complies with the UN resolution. And we have to keep ramping up these sanctions until the Iranians scrap their enrichment program. And it is important to note that the UN Security Council resolutions do call for Iran to terminate all enrichment. And this was found 60% find it convincing, Republicans even more so, but Dems down the middle, and independents still divided. Now, one more. Clearly, we need to stick with sanctions and ratchet them up higher. We can see they are working. The Iranian economy is suffering, and the Iranian people have had enough. That is why they elected a new president that was willing to come to the table. Eventually, the Iranian people are going to get tired of the economic pain that comes from the sanctions, and this will lead them to demand that Iran give up its enrichment program. We should stick with the sanctions until Iran gives up enrichment entirely. And 59% find that convincing, 65% of Republicans, and so on. And one more argument which you can check out, was not quite as effective. It said, they must really be after nuclear weapons, given all the pain they've suffered. So on the other side, well, because the U.S. has already stopped its trade with Iran, the only way Congress has been able to impose sanctions is by threatening other countries, some of them allies, with sanctions unless they stop their business relations with Iran. Sometimes we have actually punished their companies with fines. Many countries resent this. Cutting off trade with Iran hurts our other countries' economy, and they don't like being pushed around. This harms our relations with other countries, including friends and allies. And that does real well. 65% find that convincing, including 70% of both Republicans and Democrats. So they're really feeling the conundrum here. We really need to face the fact that sanctions have not worked to get Iran to give up enriching. Even as countries imposed more and more sanctions on Iran, it increased its level of enrichment activities, building more and better centrifuges, and even enriching somewhat beyond the 5% level. On the other hand, the sanctions have helped to bring Iran to the table to negotiate limits on its enrichment, and have led Iran to already accept some limits. We need to be realistic, take advantage of what has worked, and stop pursuing approaches that do not work. And again, 65% convincing. So you're probably, in the other argument that you can read, you got also 61% convincing. So you're probably thinking, oh my God, these people are this way, that way, everything's convincing, right? So the next step is, all right, let's come back to that question of evaluating each option separately on that 0 to 10 scale. And, well, what happened? Well, in terms of the, before the arguments, we had this ratio which you saw before, 46% finding negotiating limits acceptable, 34% increasing sanctions, with quite a few saying it would be at least tolerable. After the arguments, negotiating limits went up 4% under acceptable, and increasing sanctions went down 5% on acceptable. So there was a modest movement toward the negotiating limits. This was true among, afterwards you had actually Republicans more positive than Democrats on negotiating limits, with 54% finding it acceptable, 50% of Democrats, while a third of Republicans and 30% of Democrats found increasing sanctions acceptable. Okay, so then we asked them, now's the big moment, drum roll. You now need to make your final recommendation to continue to pursue the long-term agreement that limits Iran's enrichment of uranium. Iran would accept intrusive inspections of their program, while the U.S. would accept Iran enriching to the low level necessary for nuclear energy, and would gradually ease some sanctions, provided that Iran sticks to the agreement. Versus do not negotiate an agreement that includes Iran having limited enrichment, but rather impose new sanctions on other countries to get them to cut their economic relations with Iran, to pressure Iran to agree to completely stop all uranium enrichment. Well, the answer was 61% went for negotiating. So it's really quite interesting that they feel the tensions. If you add up all the numbers in terms of the convincing, it's almost equal. So it's a difficult decision. It's not that they have this pre-existing conclusion. They go both ways, but okay, now you have the choice, and they break pretty firmly toward negotiating limits at 61%. And that includes 62% of Republicans, 65% of Democrats. There's no statistically significant difference between Republicans and Democrats on this question. This is something that we have found, that the more people reason, the more you have people think things through, the differences between Republicans and Democrats actually tend to diminish. One thing we like to do is compare people who live in red districts and people who live in blue districts. We can divide the whole sample. And if what we see in the floor of Congress is a mirror of the public, you would expect some pretty significant differences, but in fact there was no significant difference at all between the red districts and the blue districts. We looked at demographic variations on this question, and there was one that was really very powerful, which is education. Among those who had less than high school education, views are divided, and then it progresses upward until those with a BA or more, it's 71% in favor of negotiating limits. Now, I just want to do a few more questions that cover a few more questions that we added at the end on U.S.-Iranian relations. On the question of the current Iranian government, views are not very positive. It's overall 79% had an unfavorable view, with 48% somewhat unfavorable and 31% very unfavorable. This is actually an improvement from when the last time we asked this question in 2006. The numbers saying very unfavorable actually have come down from 43 to 31%. Presumably that relates to the election of Rouhani as compared to the very unpopular Ahmadinejad back in 2006. Now, this raises the interesting question: are Americans interested in any way in cooperating with Iran in regard to the situation in Iraq? So we asked, as you may know, a militant group formerly associated with al-Qaeda has taken over a substantial portion of Iraq. The U.S. is providing support to the Iraqi government to help them counter this group. Iran also supports the current government of Iraq and has indicated a willingness to cooperate with the United States to help the Iraqi government regain control. Would you favor or oppose the U.S. cooperating with Iran in this effort? And same number, 61% say that they would favor that, and no difference again between Republicans and Democrats. We also asked about a number of confidence-building measures that have been proposed to help improve relations between the United States and Iran. And having direct talks by governments on issues of mutual concern, overwhelming support, 82%. Americans are just generally in favor of the whole notion of talking. Having greater cultural, educational, and sporting exchanges, 71% favored that idea. Providing more access for each other's journalists, 71% favor. Having greater trade, 55%. Which is interesting because that's kind of at odds with the whole sanctions approach. And then having more Americans and Iranians visit each other's countries as tourists. Well, that gets in a little divided response. Yeah, maybe some of those people will be spies, or who knows what this is. You know. Just one last point before I open it up. A question that has come up is when it comes to the question of Iran's nuclear program, is the prospect of having a Middle East nuclear-free zone. And this is something that makes people go, oh, well, that could never happen, right? Well, we polled on this subject in Iran, and we get a large majority there supporting the idea. And, well, but then what about Israel, you know? Israel would never accept that. Well, we polled in Israel and said it would very explicitly, that would mean that Israel would gradually have to give up its nuclear weapons as part of a regime that involved extensive inspections and so on and so forth. And 2/3 of Israelis supported it as well. So we checked up on what Americans think about this idea, and basically 69% of Americans like the idea as well. And again, that's very bipartisan. It's really consistent with American support for the long-term goal of the NPT, which is to eventually eliminate all nuclear weapons, and 77% favor that goal, and again, it's very bipartisan. So if you want to read any more details, you can find it on our website, public-consultation.org, and we thought we'd open it up for discussion, questions that are specific to the study. If you want to talk about broader questions related to U.S. foreign policy relative to Iran and so on. Let's wait until after we get to hear from our remarkable discussants who have a lot to say on the subject. But specifically on the question of the study and the public opinion issues, are there any questions at this point?
Seems like it was a very, Alberto Espinosa from the Osgood Center. It seems like it was a very complex study. I worked doing surveys back in Texas, and I was just wondering what difficulties or obstacles did you face conducting the surveys as far as like the response rate?
We had a handful of people who didn't, got started and just said, this is too hard, and just kind of bailed out of it. But I think there were 16 out of 760 something. So that is the only thing we noted. It's, it creates a lot of stress. You have to think, you hear all these competing arguments and so on. But most people did it. Most people completed it, and you can, their responses look pretty much coherent. But they can handle this kind of thing. Some of those questions are tough going, I think. It was tough to make them to write them and make them clear. I'd say that was the main one. Yeah.
The way you frame things,
Please wait for
the way you frame things implied that negotiations couldn't be talking about having Iran cease to enrich. Mm-hmm. But I was just thinking that could possibly be what they're talking about. How do you deal with that?
You mean right now in Vienna?
Yeah.
Well, all the indications are that that's not the focus of discussion. It's how to impose some limits on their enrichment. Iran has said repeatedly that if that, that they would walk from that kind of negotiation. So the idea of ramping up sanctions, which is another trigger according to the Iranians, in conjunction with going for no enrichment, is really at odds with the current effort.
Okay.
But maybe our discussants will be able to clarify that issue better than I have. Please.
It appears that this study was only focused on the nuclear. Mm-hmm. Did your study pointed out to the people about Iran's other activities because of the nuclear power and the capability in the hand of the Iranian government with regards to their other activities like support of the terrorism? Did you point that
was
out
not
at
a
all?
focus. No, it was one of these deep dives into one topic that ultimately leads to a core question. We had a few questions at the end about confidence building measures and so on, but the focus was on these negotiations, not all aspects of Iran's foreign policy or behavior.
So you noted that recommendations differ by education level among the respondents, and I'm wondering if there were any other variables that caused these recommendations to change between different values of that variable, and then also whether these variables were randomized between the GOP, Democrats, and independent groups.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean about the variables being randomized.
All right, so I guess were education levels within each party group?
Within the party.
Were there differences?
Randomized.
Yeah. The generally, well, Evan, our methodologist, statistician here, can probably speak to these questions better. He's the guy who...
We looked at a lot of different things on demographics. There were no differences when it came to gender. There were no differences when it came to region. So whether you were in a southern state or in the Northeast, it didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference, at least no statistically significant differences. We found some differences when it came to ethnicity, mostly amongst Hispanics. Hispanics were much less likely to go for a deal. We found some differences with African Americans, but it was mostly driven by the educational differences. And so the educational differences where we found the greatest significant differences between the groups that were done. We ran other analyses regarding other questions in the study, and we did find some differences. Those who didn't know anything at all about the NPT were much less likely to go for a deal, and people who, there was another question that wasn't included in the survey that talked about Huntington's thesis of conflict with the Middle East, and people who see the conflict as existing were much less likely to go for the deal. But a lot of the other demographics, there were not really any meaningful differences to talk about.
Alton Fry, Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen, you do a marvelous job of peeling away the layers within the intellectual constructs that people bring. And I may be veering into the panel's conversation, but I'd like to ask you about a hypothesis that you may or may not hold. Would it be your hypothesis that the tilt toward negotiations and away from sanctions reflects an implicit understanding that sanctions are coercive, a step on the escalation ladder, and therefore that sanctions are double-edged? They point toward an acceleration, possibly by the Iranians, of their enrichment program as a response to sanctions, while simultaneously putting the United States in the necessary preparations for military action along with Israel. Is it your assumption that those military contingencies down the way are driving the reluctance to move to sanctions, and the hope that negotiations can avoid that escalatory path is the heart of the matter?
Americans actually have a strong positive inclination to sanctions because they tend to see them as being an intermediate step that obviates the need for military action. But they also, I think, in this case, see that they're not really working, and they don't really like these extraterritorial sanctions where we, punish neighbors, and so those arguments were pretty salient. So it's not, they're not ready to take off all sanctions, and it's, I think support is definitely contingent on gradually removing them depending upon Iran's behavior. They're definitely resistant to the use of military force, and I think that does lead them to want to make a deal more. But if they thought sanctions would really do the trick, they might go for that as well. But I think they've become increasingly convinced that it's not working. And they are concerned about Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, so they see progress in that direction. That bothers them. So they're ready to try something different.
Before,
Sure.
I have one more question to ask you, but I'd like to ask our panelists to come up front now. And a question specifically about the polling. How much time do you think it takes the person being polled to go through all of these questions, to think sensibly about answers, and to return a completed poll to you?
Right.
How much time?
Well, we track it, and it varies a lot. Some people go as long as an hour, but the median response is about 16, 17 minutes.
And do you feel that most people in this country, of the 760 that you polled, would have that hour to devote to you, or to working, or to their kids? In other words, are you getting a very limited sample as opposed to a broad sample of the American people?
Right. There have been numerous studies that have addressed this question. Are the people who answer surveys different from people who don't? And the way they do that is they try really hard to get people who initially said no to agree to do it, right? And then they see then as are they different? And the answer that has come up consistently is no, they're not different in terms of the distribution of their attitudes. So that makes all people in the survey business breathe a sigh of relief because there has been this problem over the years of people being more reluctant to do these surveys. Do you have something to
I
add
just
on that?
wanted to point out for people's edification that when he says, try to convince people who initially refused to participate in the story, in the survey to participate, it usually means giving them some kind of financial inducement and convince them to participate. So they're not people who just finally suddenly have the time. That gets at Marvin Kalb's question.
Okay, thank you very much. What we're going to do now, if you don't mind, we'll get into the expertise at this point. And we have a wonderful panel, and to my immediate right is Nancy Gallagher, who's the Associate Director for Research at the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland, I'll get it right, and a Senior Research Scholar at the University of Maryland. And before coming to the university, she was the Executive Director of the Clinton Administration's Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Task Force. Seated next to her, Suzanne Mahoney. Suzanne is a Senior Fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, where her research focuses on energy, economic reform, and U.S. policy toward the Middle East. She was most recently a member of the State Department's policy planning staff covering Iran, Iraq, the Gulf states, and the broader Middle East. And George Perkovich is the Vice President for Studies and Director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research focuses on nuclear strategy, nonproliferation, concentration on South Asia, Iran, and the problem of justice in the international political community. And I'd like to start first with Nancy and ask her to, and then we'll go to Suzanne and ask you your overall reaction to the survey, what it is that you learned, what strikes you, and then we'll go on from there, please.
Do you have to push this?
No, it's fine.
So I'm going to talk briefly about what it is we were hoping to learn from the survey, and then what I think are the major takeaway points that I hope policymakers get out of this survey. Some of you may have seen David Sanger's piece in the New York Times on Sunday that quoted an American official who's been advising the White House on the policy towards Iran as saying that the current talks may be the most complex negotiations I've ever seen, because any deal that's worked out has to be not only acceptable to the leaders of the P5 and Iran who are engaged in the negotiations, but to Congress in the United States and to the Iranian political, religious, and parliamentarian leadership. So it's what we call two-level negotiations, and they are extremely complicated. Sanger also reported on a letter to the Obama administration that's currently being circulated in the Senate by Robert Menendez, who's a Democrat who leads the Foreign Senate Relations Committee, and Republican Lindsey Graham, who's on the Senate Armed Services Committee, which would condition Senate support for any deal that lifts sanctions or lifts partial sanctions relief on conditions that sound like they would almost certainly be unacceptable to Iran. The details of what's in that letter aren't public yet, but the kinds of things that Sanger was mentioning was that Iran would have to be under some sort of specially tight restrictions and inspections for at least 20 years, and that the IAEA would have to have complete access to any facility, document, or person suspected of involvement in past work on nuclear weapons. The official noted that both the United States and Iranian sides are using constraints they face back home as a reason why they can't compromise any further than they already have in the negotiations, and why therefore it's up to the other side to make all the remaining concessions if there's going to be a deal. And it's hard to know from the outside how much of that is basically diplomatic theatrics and how much of it's hardball negotiating tactics, and how much of it's really real. And so that's part of what we were trying to get at. There's no doubt that there are some hardliners in both the United States and Iran who would actually like the negotiations to fail in such a way that they can blame the other side for it. But we have no way of knowing from the outside how big those factions are in either of the two countries. in an attempt to get at that question, a lot is being made of the fact that an earlier letter organized by Menendez and Graham and signed by 81 senators, including all 4 senators from Maryland and Virginia, and sent to President Obama in March of this year, laid out a set of general principles that they wanted the negotiations to follow, and essentially said, in order for us to be willing to support a deal, it has to be in line with these broad principles. The big question facing members of the Senate right now, I think, particularly those who signed that initial letter, is, okay, now that it comes time, they're being asked to sign the second letter that gets into much more details about what those requirements would be. Should they sign it or should they not? Okay, and that's really the question that we were trying to pose to the American public, right? What do your constituents want you to do? And we deliberately did not get down in the weeds of a lot of the kinds of things that you see debated in the press, exactly how many centrifuges, how many years, exactly what kind of inspection provisions. As the policy person in our group, when we were writing this all, I kept wanting to get in more details, and my public opinion experts kept saying, no, just focus on the core issue. And I am convinced, after having gone through all of this, that the details don't matter to the public. It's this core choice between a deal that places some limits on Iran's enrichment capability that don't currently exist, that includes increased international inspections over that which already does exist, and that provides some sanction relief, versus not negotiating anymore, instead ramping up sanctions and hoping that sanctions somehow produce a change in Iranian behavior when they haven't worked in the past. Okay? So you can say this is, basically giving the public a choice between a bird in the hand versus 2 in the bush, when we've been hunting for those 2 in the bush for a really, really long time and haven't been able to get them so far. Okay? So it's not saying people, would you prefer a deal that allows Iran to have limited enrichment versus a deal that has no enrichment? Right? That's not the choice on the table. It's a limited enrichment deal or no deal, increased sanctions, and whatever that leads to. Now, as you've heard, majorities on both sides found arguments pro and con at least somewhat convincing, although there were significant differences between how many people said that the arguments were at somewhat convincing, right, and just much smaller numbers that found them very convincing. But I think that it's important that when you gave people the full set of pro and con arguments on both sides, and they listened to all these different arguments, what you see is support for the limited deal solidifying. It goes up, and support for the sanctions options go down. So, what that tells me is that if we had a full debate with both positions being argued with equal vigor, that I would expect support for the limited deal to remain strong. It wouldn't suddenly collapse if there was this full debate, and probably support for the sanctions option would continue to go down at least somewhat. There was a clear bipartisan preference for limited enrichment deal over imposing more sanctions. I think that's really important for people to remember. And interestingly to me, the arguments in favor of the limited enrichment deal that did the best with both Republicans and Democrats basically emphasized pragmatism. We're better off with a deal than without, no matter what happens. And fairness, right? Under the NPT, countries, non-nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT, can conduct enrichment. Iran wants to be treated like any other non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT.
Nancy, I'm sorry, were you?
Pardon me?
I was just wondering if we could possibly move on to Suzanne now, and then we'll come back and pick up the other points that you'd like to make.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I think the survey itself was really interesting and obviously very well timed given where we are in terms of the negotiations. I think what's so important about the survey is not so much the responses, but the process, which suggests that when you present the American public with objective information that they, in many cases, didn't have prior to the opportunity to review it, that if they have an opportunity to review not just the arguments that appeal to their instinctive biases, but in fact the pros and cons of either option, and obviously there has to be some simplification in order to do this, that in fact what you get is American support for a diplomatic process. And I don't think that in any case this should come as a surprise to those of us who believe that this is in fact the natural orientation of the American people to support diplomacy, to support negotiations, and to favor, as Nancy said, pragmatic solutions to intractable problems. I'm interested in the whole question of public opinion, U.S. public opinion and public diplomacy toward Iran, in part because I think that Iran is sort of the exception to the rule, which is that most Americans, and I come from Middle America or something like Middle America, so I feel that I have some authority to say this, but I think most Americans don't actually have a strong sense of who's up, who's down, who our friends are and who our enemies are in the Middle East. And I think this is a perennial issue. I remember back to starting graduate school in 1990, working on the Middle East, and my mother sort of pulled me aside and said, can you show me exactly where Saudi Arabia is? I think that's the sort of perceptions of most Americans. Iran is the exception, of course, because so many Americans have either a historic association with Iran, the revolution, the economic disruptions that followed, the hostage crisis, which was in many ways sort of the making of the modern media, and then, of course, of the prolonged dispute that has characterized the relationship and the hostility, antagonisms, and direct combat in some cases over the course of the past 35 years. But it comes, of course, in a moment where there is clear aversion to further entanglements in the Middle East, an aversion that is born of a decade of war and entrenched, I think, by the sense of chaos, violence, and unpredictability that we see around the region. And so you have this sort of American perception of an Iran that has been a bad actor, a perception that was undoubtedly exacerbated by the former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and I think the differentiation in those final results that Dr. Kulls projected on U.S. views of Iran are indicative of the ways in which Ahmadinejad was able to, in fact, degrade what was always a somewhat problematic opinion of Iran. But in fact, there is also this aversion to anything that looks like it's pushing us further along a path toward military conflict. When I think about this, and obviously in a Washington environment, we spend a lot of time talking to or responding to discussion on the Hill, I wonder to what extent public opinion matters. And you can really sort of mirror that on the Iranian side. To what extent does public opinion matter here? To what extent does public opinion matter there in terms of the diplomacy that's being undertaken right now and the prospects of a deal? I think what this particular study suggests is that the Obama administration has a pretty good case to make and has a pretty solid standing as it pursues negotiations. I sense a certain fatalism when I talk to U.S. officials. They know that they're going to be hammered by the Hill irrespective of the terms of the deal. They know that there's going to be a fierce critique of any bargain that they may be able to strike. But they also have this conviction, which I think is underpinned by this study, that Americans basically are willing to live with an imperfect deal, that they're not looking for perfection, in part because they probably have somewhat realistic standards of what's likely to be achieved. And so I think that what this study really does suggest is that if the administration is able to secure some sort of a compact with the Iranians, and obviously that remains very much in doubt at the moment, despite the fact that there will likely be a lot of opposition and efforts to explicitly undermine it, the administration will probably be able to sell it. And I think, in fact, that message, that sense of realism isn't entirely lost on Congress as well, and we can get into some of the other events in the course of the past year or so that have I think suggested that Congress has a somewhat realistic understanding of where the American people are at. I just wanted to say a couple of final points, which is that I think that the other aspect of this study, which is so interesting, is that it really focuses on the two big issues of these negotiations. One, the technical issue of enrichment, which has been the issue that has stymied any resolution to this process since at least 2006, when the United States, when the then Bush administration decided to join the negotiations and effectively created this thing we now know as the P5+1. There is a legitimate reason for the focus on enrichment from our side, and the Iranians would argue that there's a legitimate reason for their determination, a determination that has cost them at least $100 billion, if not more, to refuse to compromise on that. But I think getting this issue into the minds of the American people and exploring to what extent Americans understand why enrichment is important and why it has been the major technical issue that is the focus of these negotiations is a very positive dimension of the study. The second issue is this issue of sanctions, and I think that there is an unfamiliarity with sanctions and the way that they've been used with respect to Iran, and the extent to which their quote-unquote success over the course of the past few years in bringing Iran to the negotiating table is not, in fact, a natural condition. We had a very unique moment in which there was widespread international cooperation with these somewhat untested measures. The decision to ban U-turn transactions by the Iranian financial system was effectively unprecedented in the scope and the reach that was applied to Iran. And the extent to which the Europeans, many of Iran's traditional trading partners, even those outside of Europe, were willing to go along with those measures, reflected not just their priority on access to the international financial system, but also I think this recognition that Iran was in a uniquely dangerous set of circumstances during the course of the past few years. The change in government in Iran has begun to erode that perception, as Steve's results show. And many other factors will as well, potentially changes in energy markets, which make it harder to create this degree of international consensus. But I think, again, the focus on these two issues, enrichment and sanctions, was a very appropriate one.
Suzanne, thank you. George, your comments, please.
Yeah, just a few quick points. One, and Steve knows, he was kind enough to bring a draft of the survey to me, and I read it, and I have a certain amount of cynicism about public's knowledge of these issues and so on. And I read some of the arguments, because I thought the arguments were very well done, but I read some of the arguments kind of against the negotiations, and I said, we're just going to get killed, because if you don't know anything, these arguments are really compelling. And he said, no, you got to trust the process, because actually, the other arguments actually are strong too when you read them, and then you have to start matching them together. And I think the result of the survey actually bears that out, that in a sense, this method kind of models a rational thought process and a dialectical process. And so I think the result, if at least from where I stand and my knowledge of these issues and so on, it's a fairly rational result. I'll say a little more about that. But I would say that actually the process that Steve and his group took the respondents through is in fact much more rational than the process in which the U.S. government's operating. And I'm totally serious. I'm willing to bet that most senators and most members of Congress haven't spent an hour thinking about this, as the respondents did. And in fact, they haven't been exposed to very cogent arguments on multiple sides, as has happened here. I have some experience going up and briefing members, and I found that it's been remarkable. They've been visited by other groups, many of which write checks, and so they have a certain view, and then you start taking them through things, and they keep saying, wait, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that about the NPT. I didn't know that about the Iraq War. and that the U.S. was on the side of Saddam, who was using chemical weapons against Iran. And so I had no idea. And so, those are half-hour interactions where you start to complicate the thinking and put some information in. But I think that's fairly unusual. I think for most members, they don't spend any time on this other than if they're meeting somebody who's going to give them a check, and then they'll end up voting with the party. Although on the Iran, a very important point on the Iran sanctions, the bill that was put out last December, and now the letter that's come out, that's bipartisan. So there are a number of Democrats who also co-sponsor on this. And I think I would refer to my earlier point about see who gives checks, and that basically. So this point is the process here is more rational than that which exists normally in the course of our government, number one. Second point, it's so vital in all of this, whether there is a debate and in whatever happens, that you have to have the part that says, okay, compared to what? Because any policy that's pursued, you can find flaws in it because it's gonna be imperfect. And it's gonna rely on assumptions that may or may not come to pass. There are gonna be risks in anything that's done. And so a lot of the debate or the political discourse, is persuasive like any one of these arguments is, but you have to then decide compared to what. And when you do the compared to what, I think you're more likely to actually get the outcome that the respondents here thought was the wiser outcome, that I would say is the wiser outcome as well. And so that will be the challenge. And I think that's where the administration is relatively confident, is that when it gets down to it, when they make the compared to what argument, what they're doing will appear more appealing. Which leads to the question that somebody, I forget if it was Suzanne or Nancy raised, does opinion matter? Does public opinion matter? And there I think there is something a little more subtle going on, and it may refer to what Alton was alluding to. I don't think, my guess is that political decision makers don't really care what the public thinks on this issue because they conclude the public doesn't care that much about it. In other words, I remember years ago I worked for Senator Biden, then Senator Biden, and he voted on something, it was something about means testing Social Security. It was clearly the right thing to do, but he voted against it. And I remember he came in that evening and a bunch of us were sitting on the couch and he looks up, he says, "What? You're mad about that?" And he said, "Let me show you something about the new math." Because it was the thing that he voted against had like 78% support. So he voted for like the 19% with some undecided position. And he says, the new math is that the 19% are all retirees on this, and they're all going to base their vote exactly on this one vote that I did. So the other 70 whatever, who cares? Because they're not going to vote based on this. And I don't think anybody's going to vote in an election based on the position that somebody took on an Iran negotiation. Some people will write checks, but nobody's going to vote on it. And what people would care about and would vote about is another war. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the administration, in trying to block the sanctions earlier this year, invoked the alternative is war. And it really angered a lot of the proponents of sanctions. They said, this is unfair, it's not about war. But that's the one issue that actually makes this, I think, something that the public actually would care about. And last quick point I know is there's a broader issue, total parentheses, but a broader issue. These sanctions, wherein the U.S. basically will deny other countries access to our financial system based on what they do with Iran, are a very, very powerful tool. But I think one of the things that we find in terms of U.S. public opinion, and we'll see it increasingly in Europe and elsewhere, is you have to be very careful about using it, because if you overdo it, at some point there can be a backlash. And part of the problem is if it's a U.S. Congress that's imposing these kinds of sanctions and doing it in a general way that much of the world finds disrespectful or idiotic or ignorant or whatever, What has been a very effective tool on Iran may not be accessible or available in the future, and we got to be very, very careful about that.
Thanks to all three experts. I find one thing particularly striking. We started by saying, Stephen and I, that there are two options before the House, so to speak. One, to strike some kind of acceptable deal, however reluctantly it is struck, and the other was to stop the Iranians from having nuclear weapons completely. Listening to the three of you, I would say there's only one option, and that is to strike a deal. None of you seems to entertain seriously the option of going to war to stop the Iranians from having a bomb. Am I correct? Susan?
Well, as I understood the study, it's positing the distinction between enrichment and a deal.
But we make the assumption, I think, that the whole argument starts with you raise enrichment to a certain point, you go on the road to a bomb. And it just struck me simply because you start with an assumption, but the experts are telling us basically that there's only one possible reasonable outcome from this negotiation, and that is a deal. And that makes a kind of logical sense, but it strikes at the heart of the logic that we're striking here, if there are two. Stephen?
Well, I would, in a sense, contest that there is an option, which is to ramp up sanctions, and with the idea that you're going to stop all enrichment. So basically to not make a deal. And there are a lot of voices in Congress that are articulating that position, and that position does get, when you present it, a majority of Americans say that they would find it at least tolerable. So I don't think it's quite right to say that it's not in play at all. It is in play, and it is, in a sense, the choice point that,
No, I was saying
that we're
it's not
facing.
in play here. It may be in play up on the Hill. And what I find interesting is the result of your study seems to fight the politics up on the Hill. There's a collision between what the public appears to want, however reluctantly, and what the Congress appears to favor. And so you have that collision. Now, maybe that's not for the first time.
There is a difference there. The Americans, but it's important to note that they're not already there. They're not all crystallized. It's
right.
When they finally have to make a choice, they break really clearly. But many members, if you had a town hall meeting and you were making the case for ramping up sanctions and we got to stop them from enrichment, it's too risky, you'd get a lot of heads nodding. And then down the street, you'd have another member of Congress holding a town hall meeting and saying, we got to make a deal. We got to contain this thing. It's the safest thing to do. It's least likely to lead to a nuclear weapon. And you get a lot of heads nodding, and both members of Congress would think that their constituents are with them, right?
Right.
So it's not that the public has crystallized and said, here it is. That's the outcome when they have this opportunity to deliberate. It's the dominant one, even in standard polls. But what's clear is that it's not fully crystallized, but it's moving in that direction.
Okay. Nancy, you wanted to say
Yeah.
something, and then please, any questions that you have, just raise your hand and I'll recognize as many as possible. Hang on. Yes.
In both, the briefing materials that we gave people, we tried to be very, very factual, and we vetted those briefing materials with Republican and Democratic staffers so that they agreed that, yes, this is an accurate factual statement, and this is the sort of core amount of information that people absolutely have to have to make an informed decision one way or the other. And we were very clear about the fact that the United States has been trying to get Iran to stop enrichment altogether, has used sanctions trying to pressure Iran to do that for a lengthy period of time, and that so far hasn't worked, okay? We didn't say it absolutely couldn't work in the future, but we made it clear that we've tried that for a long time and it hasn't worked. We deliberately did not, specifically say the alternative is war. Because people on the Hill aren't currently arguing that way, okay? And we didn't want to make the sort of most inflammatory arguments that you could make on either side. We wanted to stick with the arguments that people really were making. But when people were to respond, in effect, pragmatically and say, look at, we've been trying to use sanctions to get total enrichment. It hasn't worked. Getting limits, which we don't currently have beyond the broad NPT limits, would leave us better off than we were, right? That was a recognition that if you tried more sanctions, you were almost certainly going to end up with no additional limits, and you could very likely lead to war. And even that, right, might not stop Iran's program. So, I think that it was implicit in there, but we didn't want to really push the sort of most extreme versions of either the pro and con arguments.
Suzanne, briefly, and then I want to go to
Very
David.
briefly, I think the distinction that you see between the politics of the Hill and the politics that come out in this study is also reflective of the distinction in the information that's given and the way that the information is presented. And so the fact that these questions and these assertions were put forward in a very objective, fact-based manner, as opposed to the way that most of the political debate on Iran is conducted. You don't hear discussions about enrichment that are entirely limited, that are passionless. And had this been phrased differently, had Americans who did this study been asked, do you favor a deal that allows Iran to continue working a technology that may lead it to break out to a nuclear weapon without the international community being able to stop it, or even something more incendiary than that, I think you might have gotten different results.
And it would have been
Well,
extremely.
You could say nuclear arm could lead to a nuclear armed Iran.
Right.
So-
We
Would have been
did
extremely
try to
interesting.
incorporate those arguments as well as we could. And they were in a sense confirmed by the people who were making those arguments, that you're by letting them enrich even at a low level, they're refining their capability, and that increases their breakout potential.
Yes.
Ann Harrington, I'm a APSA congressional fellow, and I want to propose a slightly different interpretation of what's going on based on a couple observations about what's been happening
This
on the
is
Hill.
for a question, not a speech, so question.
Back when the Kirk-Menendez legislation was much more popular, there was a moment at which AIPAC backed off that, and the phone calls coming in from the people who are donating money shifted in terms of what people were saying. And since then, there have been these series of letters, but in some ways I would propose that it's a lot more rational than it might look from the outside, because Congress is also aware of the fact that it's participating in the two-level game. It has a limited number of tools at its disposal, and there is not a lot of trust of the Obama administration's ability to stay firm on issues. So Congress, in writing these letters and taking a really hard line, sees itself as actually participating in the deterrence paradigm. And I think that that's an important piece of this conversation that explains the behavior in a much more rational way. And
Okay, do you have a question?
I'm curious about the impression of that from the panelists.
George, why don't you-
I think that's basically right, and especially the morphing from when the momentum got turned on the Menendez-Kirk-Schumer bill and AIPAC backed off for a while and stuff. And by the way, the government of Israel, once the Joint Plan of Action, started being implemented, several of them, officials have come and said, we were wrong, actually this is working. And so there's an appreciation that actually what was negotiated in November really has worked and been effective. And your point about the letter being an indicator to the Iranians, you better make a deal with these people, otherwise, all that's fine. The question that hasn't been answered is what happens next Monday or next Wednesday if the diplomacy breaks down, or if there's an agreement on terms that people who wrote those letters don't agree. Will they behave rationally, or will they actually react very quickly in a way that would drive the Iranians back in an escalatory process? There I'm not as sanguine as you are. This has been the easy part for them. The total burden is on the Obama administration and the Iranians. Congress is a free rider. And so you write a letter and say, get these terms, and we're being responsible, we're not messing with you, we understand. It's an absolute freebie. And so they can pretend to be a little more rational. But let's see what happens if this breaks down.
Yeah, I think you're right that, members of Congress from both parties probably imagine that they are playing a constructive role in a two-level game. My guess is that there are many Republicans that don't trust the Obama administration to stay firm, and that there are many Democrats who do think the Obama administration is going to get the best deal that it can, but that they're somehow helping the administration get a better deal by taking this really hardline stance. What I would say is that it's different to sign on to a letter about general principles than it is to sign on to a letter that's making specific demands, because once you commit yourself to very specific demands, it's harder after the fact to say, well, how important are those really to me? And I think the most helpful thing at the moment is to let the administration try to get the best deal they can and then evaluate it, as opposed to committing yourself in advance about whether or not those specific terms are acceptable, or saying the deal absolutely must have X, Y, or Z, or else I'm not going to support it, when you don't know what the total package is going to look like.
That's the whole idea that Suzanne was raising before about giving diplomacy a chance right now to work its magic or not. Another question? I have one. Turn this discussion around and let us assume that we're sitting in Tehran now, not in Washington, where there is a plethora of discussions of this sort, not specifically this type of poll, but of this sort. What do you do with Iran? And you're in Tehran, and what do you do with America now? And I would start with Susan and then go to George. What is your sense about what the policymakers are thinking in Tehran about this issue? Are they really trying to get a deal, the best deal they possibly can? Are they trying to satisfy an extreme force in the political world in Tehran? What is happening there? What do you sense? Because you're not there, you're here. Let's start with Suzanne.
I'll start, but I'll highlight that George has just come back from Tehran, whereas I haven't been there in quite a while, so my views are inherently limited as a result. I think Rouhani was elected with a mandate to get a deal. He has been given almost unparalleled scope of maneuver within the Iranian political system and within the diplomatic environment to try to get that deal, but it will have to be a deal that accords to the parameters of hardliners, and it's unclear whether a deal that will be acceptable back at home to the constituencies that matter on this issue is one that the P5+1 can accept and can sell to the constituencies that matter for their politics. I think that Iranian public opinion does matter. I think that one of the reasons that we're here today, or that we're at the point where we're at in terms of the talks, is that this is a system, the Iranian system is in fact fairly sensitive to public dissatisfaction, despite the fact that it's clearly not a democracy, and that, you know, the distance between public opinion and foreign policy decision-making is far greater in Iran even than it is in the United States. This is a system that recognizes that when the strains of economic pressures are too great, that endangers its own longevity. And it was quite clear that the transformation of Iran's approach to diplomacy on this issue, and I would argue the orchestration of a new and much more moderate diplomatic front under the presidency of Hassan Rouhani, was an implicit, tacit acknowledgement of fears of public dissatisfaction over the economic situation. And so, you know, they're playing a multi-level game as well. I think the proposal that Foreign Minister Javad Zarif floated apparently over the course of the past day is one that is going to be very difficult to sell back here at home. And I think this whole question of not deal or no deal, but what does a continuing process look like, is going to be a very, very complex one. It's not to, I don't believe that any process or any extension is inherently a negative, but I think that we do create the possibility of an ever-enduring process which doesn't in fact lead to a resolution, and which frankly isn't going to satisfy hardliners in either capital, because it's not going to lead to the benefits that either is looking for.
George.
Just briefly, I agree with what Suzanne said. I mean, it's, in simple terms, the election of Rouhani in Iranian politics, there are at least two fundamental visions. There's one that Rouhani and Zarif embodies, which is, look, they want Iran to be a major player in the region and globally, as it deserves to be based on its culture, its size, its history, its talents, and so on. And the way to get that proper role is to end the isolation by making a deal on the nuclear program and engaging in diplomacy that lets Iran back onto the center stage where it belongs. And so they want to do that. And by the way, that would also help satisfy young people who want to be part of the international system, travel more. It's kind of bringing Iran more into the international system. There's another group, to simplify, that sees that as the beginning of the end. That, in fact, isolation has helped Iran, and there are people who make their money on having an isolated economy because they manage the smuggling, the terms of trade. They don't have international trade, so they get the big contracts, and who see opening as a way to actually dilute support. It's poison. It's the Western, toxification of Iran. And so that's part of a conflict. So for Rouhani and Zarif, this nuclear negotiation matters so much because if they can get a good deal, it will solidify their personal standing, but also kind of their whole political orientation in upcoming elections in Iran. And so it will give them much greater power. Well, their opponents think the same thing. And this is much like happens here between the Republicans. If Obama gets a big victory, it's good for the Democrats, and therefore we've got to block it. Except Iranian politics, I mean, if you lose, you go to jail, or at least they try you. And so the stakes are much higher there, and I think it's a much greater challenge. Last 2 points on this. There is also now a nuclear establishment in Iran. And in any other country that has a nuclear establishment, you find that it's very difficult to run against these guys. We found this in India, for example, where the U.S. and India tried to make a nuclear deal, where the U.S. was giving things to India. I mean, as Phil Zelikow said at the time, it was a gift horse, and the Indians still wouldn't take it because their nuclear establishment wanted to remain on its own and didn't want foreign competition. So now you've got the Iranian nuclear establishment saying, we don't want to rely on international supplies, we don't want to rely on international cooperation because we know how to do it better ourselves, leave us alone to do this. And so they're pushing hard against any limitation. And it'll cause unemployment, it'll destroy the morale of our brilliant young scientists and engineers. And so that's a hard issue for the negotiators to deal with. And the last point I would make is, the leader ultimately will decide, and he last week set out some terms, and it's not clear how much he knows, how expert he is. You can think about leaders that we've had in the past who probably aren't very expert in the details of nuclear technology, nuclear energy requirements, and so on. Well, square that. I mean, there's no basis for thinking he really has paid much attention, understands.
Yeah, but what difference does that make?
Because the negotiation now is about details. The negotiation is about.
But he can decide whether negotiation succeeds or not, can he?
No, but he depends on what he knows. If he's been told and he believes they absolutely require 190,000 centrifuges to be able to maintain their vital bodily fluids and independence, and if he really believes that, then there's not going to be a deal. Whereas if other people get to him and say, well, actually, we could do it this other way and rely on a lot less, then you might be able to get a deal. But we don't know how much he knows.
Is there a question in the audience? Now suddenly there are 2 and 3. No. Start there, here, and here. Quick questions and please quick answers. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Harry Halem. I'm a writer and editor for armscontrolwonk.com, and I'm an incoming freshman at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. And I'd like to ask about the idea of a credible threat and use of force on the part of the United States. Throughout the presentation and the panel discussion here, I've heard multiple times that the U.S. public and U.S. Congress really does not want to engage in another military conflict in the Middle East, regardless of what the possible benefits of engaging in it and the possible drawbacks of not doing so. Do you think, A, that aversion damages the U.S. position in these negotiations? Do you think that the U.S. still has that credible threat behind it if negotiations fail and if Iran does decide to pursue breakout.
Okay, hang on.
And-
That's a good question.
Okay.
Hang
sure.
on, hang on. Your question, and then your question, and we'll get the answers.
Thanks for doing this, you guys. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. I cover foreign policy for Bloomberg News. George, following up on what you were just saying about the Supreme Leader talking about 190,000 separative work units, I want to know to what extent you think he has boxed in his negotiators by saying that, even if he doesn't understand it. And of course, SWs are not exactly the same as centrifuges, I don't think. But you know, how much has he made it harder for Zarif, and is it essentially game over at that point? And I'd like to ask.
No, one question.
Well,
Thank you. Yours.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Zina Salah. I'm originally from Egypt here on a fellowship in DC for the summer, and I wanted to get back to the survey, Stephen, and I want to ask you if you think providing these informative briefings to the people who took the survey makes it less representative of the American public opinion, because people on the street, they do not know that stuff. To what extent do you think that creates a gap between the real public opinion and the results of the survey?
Thank you very much for those final questions. And what I would please ask the panel, starting with Stephen, is use answers to these questions as an opportunity also to state a final point and see if each of you can do it inside of 1 minute. In my business, that's a long time.
Okay. The goal of a survey like this isn't simply to find out what's on the surface of people's minds. That's what a standard political poll does. What we're trying to do is reveal here the public's underlying values and priorities and bring them and see how they come to bear on the information and that members of Congress have. That's why we call it a policymaking simulation, putting themselves in the shoes of a policymaker and seeing how those values and those values and priorities don't appear all of a sudden, while they're doing this. They express themselves. And at this point, the public does not have a real clear idea. That's one thing we can tell from this. It's not crystallized. And relevant to something that George said earlier, what it does is tells us what would happen if we had a bigger debate, if things were really joined, and Congress was more involved, and it was more in the media, and people got more information. So it sort of plays the camera forward, so we see what happens if the public got more engaged and there was a real coming to public judgment and people had more information. So we see the trajectory. And that's really the significance of it too, because from a political perspective, you get this information, you think, well, if this really comes to a head, how am I going to do, right? And I think that's what's relevant. It's also, when we've done these, when the staffers often say, these people are going to know more than my member of Congress knows when they get finished taking this 20-minute process, right? So that process of engagement and thinking through and deliberation is something that happens in Congress as well as the public if this were to come to a head.
Okay. Nancy, please.
Sure, 2 quick points. Number one, on the question of Iranian public opinion, stay tuned. We're actually doing a companion survey that University of Tehran is running right now. And I think what we're likely to find out there is that it's not simply, sort of Zarif and Rouhani versus the hardliners, and that Zarif and Rouhani would like to agree to anything to get a deal, but that there are very clear constraints on them as well from the more moderate factions of public opinion. Strong beliefs across all spectrums that Iran needs to be allowed to continue enriching, and that Iran should not be treated fundamentally differently from other countries over an extended period of time. On the question of does the United States have a credible threat of military force, I think the basic issue that we're looking at here is, do Americans think that continuing to try more coercive diplomacy, whether that's tighter sanctions or, yet again making threats of military force, is that going to change Iran's position on stopping enrichment altogether? I don't think there's any reason to believe that it will. So, yes, the United States could make those threats again. I don't think it will change things. It could even carry out those threats. And frankly, I don't think that would change the ultimate outcome.
If it carried out those threats, it might very well. Suzanne.
Two hopefully quick points on the issue of the credibility of the U.S. military threat. I'd just say you go to war with the public opinion that you have, and we're at where we're at in that respect. I don't think that any public discussion of this changes Iranian perceptions, because there's such deep-seated paranoia about U.S. intentions that I don't think you would ever find an Iranian from any aspect of the political spectrum on that side rule out the possibility of the use of force against Iran. In terms of the Supreme Leader's speech, it wasn't directed to me, but I'm going to comment on that very quickly anyway. I would make two very quick points. One is that the Supreme Leader's statements on the nuclear issue often offer a kind of Rorschach test into the perceptions of the listener. And so it's quite possible to take away whichever pessimistic or optimistic interpretation of that speech, depending on where you sit in the beginning. I would also point out that if you look at prior crises that involved Iran, as well as in some cases the U.S., we saw rhetoric up to the very end of the Iran-Iraq war from Ayatollah Khomeini, then Supreme Leader, that Iran would never bend, and that was really up until the acceptance of the ceasefire. In the hostage crisis, there were very erratic proposals from the Iranian side in the final weeks, both erratically negative and erratically positive in the final weeks. And finally, I think that what the Supreme Leader's speech speaks to, and we've seen it persistently in the Iranian position in the talks, is that Iran does not want to give up its centrifuges. They are looking for a solution that does not involve taking a hammer to thousands of machines that have been critical to its position over the course of the past decade. And whether or not there's a technical solution that somehow satisfies both sides, I will turn it to George.
Well, on that one, I mean, I agree with what Suzanne said, and Indira, I think that what he's basically saying is we're not going to dismantle anything, and I think that's that is a great challenge. I mean, the issue actually isn't the one of zero enrichment. Now the question is how much enrichment, and he said we're not going to dismantle anything. That will be a problem. The 190 SWU could be finessed, and I think his statement itself talked about it. I'm not saying tomorrow or next year, but so you finesse the 190 SWU, which is the longer term, by saying that no one's denying Iran it can have that once it's fulfilled the agreement, and at the end of the agreement it'll be a normal country. So fine. So it's about a time function. So I think that could be addressed. On the force issue, I would agree with Suzanne, first of all. Secondly, to Iranians, including the current officials, a threat of force actually makes it harder for them to do what we want, because then the idea, if you make a concession, then you're giving in to the threat of force, which just encourages people to keep doing it to you. So it's counterproductive. This is about a pacifier for people here, and it's about domestic politics. Well, threaten force. If you really wanted to scare the Iranians, the president should take force off the table and move aircraft carriers out of the Gulf. Then they'll think the fight's coming. Because first of all, in order to attack, we would move the aircraft carriers out of the Gulf. So when we're not serious, we move them into the Gulf. And like Suzanne said, the plot would be when the U.S. says it's not going to do it. So the premise of your question is just that's about domestic theater in the United States and how to deter Republicans or Democrats.
George, thank you very much, and Suzanne and Nancy, and thank you all very much for coming. I want especially to thank Stephen Cull for this excellent survey, and it's representative of an effort that Cull has made now over several years to try to inject an additional element of sanity into the way in which this government functions and the way in which public opinion can influence proper decision-making on the part of the government. So thanks to him, and thanks to you all for being here.